Good afternoon and welcome to the Center for Healthy Sex daily meditation webinar. Today's topic is sexual politics, and this is part of our Love, Intimacy, and Healthy Sex with me, Dr. Alex Katehakis. I want to remind you to ask questions. Today I'm going to ask you to ask questions or put them in the text box so that I can see them and respond to you directly. And during the first part of the webinar, I want you to think about the question: what political statements are you making through your relationships, your communications, your actions, and appearance to practice your sexual philosophy in your life? And this is kind of a hot topic because there's been a lot about sex and politics this year. There's been a lot of sexually political issues that are in the media right now. So let's take a look at, what we've written about sexual politics. And of course, this is before all of these sexual harassment cases have come out, and certainly about some of the sexual politics that we have right now. So Christopher Delphi and Diana Leonard write, "For us, men and women are not two naturally given groups who at some time fell into a hierarchical relationship. Rather, the reason the two groups are distinguished socially is because one dominates the other." And I believe that statement really speaks to the patriarchy, and it speaks to the patriarchal issues we're seeing in the media today with the Harvey Weinstein case, and many, many others in Hollywood, and not just in Hollywood, but people in the radio, television business, magazine business, and the world of politics. So people are said to be, quote, playing politics when they manipulate and use others for their own end. And the politics that seeks power over others for selfish reasons is almost always based on fear. So if we were to look at in general, the dynamics between what we have now in our culture, which are extremely powerful men who are in positions of power wherein they can do something for someone if they want to. And their choice is to exploit those someones, typically women, although there are a couple of accounts now of agents and actors who have been sexually exploiting either underage males or other males also, in order to get what they want. So the actual use of sex, or it's not really about sex, it's about exploitation. It's about power, it's about fear, it's about selfishness, and certainly about control. And this can take place also whenever there's any kind of power differential, whether it's doctor-patient, even therapist-patient, also agent-client, any place, boss, assistant, secretary, all of those power differentials play out. And again, male, female, also people of color with white people. These dynamics are playing out all the time. And when we infuse them with sex and sexuality, that becomes harassment. And that harassment is a form of treachery, it's a form of violence, and it's certainly meant to terrify the other person into submission, so the person who is the perpetrator is acting on getting what they want, the way they want it, and how they want it. And oftentimes they even sort of, quote, get off on the power and control more than the sex. I mean, the power and control is part of what's arousing to the perpetrator when it comes to the sex. There are also family politics. We all grew up in saturated by family politics, and we learned that certain people address certain situations with frightening behavior. So you may have grown up with a parent whose way of managing things in the household was to be domineering, dictatorial, aggressive, even downright violent, and we learn how to manipulate those situations in a way that is, quote, politic or politically correct in order to stay safe or even just to survive sometimes. To avoid punishment or mistreatment, we find ways to live in complex situations, and sometimes those complex situations can get progressively complex, especially if you have say an alcoholic parent who's getting progressively worse in their disease. So In those cases, human beings learn how to manipulate those situations, how to maneuver around the obstacles in order to get what we want and need. And sometimes, unwittingly, if we grow up in families like that, we end up being perpetrators ourselves. And I believe that's what we're seeing with all these perpetrators in the media, all these sexual perpetrators. If we look closely, there's undoubtedly some sort of abuse in their own childhoods, physical, emotional, sexual, abject neglect. Those situations are a setup for a child to be deeply angry because they didn't get what they wanted and needed. And as they grow into adulthood, much of that gets dissociated. And then they start to feel entitled, because entitlement is an enormous part of sexual harassment. And the more successful somebody gets, the more entitled they feel. They feel like they're above the law, that they're not going to suffer consequences for what they've done. And as such, they start to perpetrate on people who feel like they need them or feel like they have to capitulate even. But if there's a young person who feels like they have to do what the powerful person wants them to do because of their hopes and dreams, especially if they want to be an actor, or they want to rise up in the company that they're in, or they think they're going to get the better job that somebody else does. People that are marginalized, typically people of color, certainly women, gay males, children, any really minority is going to feel like they have to take a one-down position and capitulate to the person in power in order to climb the ladder, whatever the ladder is. And unfortunately, our culture has been complicit in these politics because they have kept us in a place of sort of perpetrating this mythology and also being the keeper of the secrets. And finally, these secrets are cracking open and more people are coming forward. And this is what's necessary to change these political ideas about what's okay and what isn't okay in the workforce. So the survival instinct demands that we continually reorient ourselves within the group dynamics. We are, as I've said before, salient-seeking creatures, and that means we are always looking for that which is meaningful. That's what salient means. So we're always looking for food, for shelter, for safety, for the things that ultimately for the things that keep us safe. And once we're safe, then the salience becomes about preference, about beauty, about novelty. So what kind of food, what kind of house do I want to buy or live in? These are more privileged things that we get to pick out after we're safe at a very base level. And when we're in a group dynamic, whether it's a family or a workplace, where it's toxic or unsafe, we're always going to be reorienting ourselves in that group in order to find our place there and figure out what we will do and what we won't do and what we have to do in order to survive. And for many of us, this kind of survival strategy resulted in internalized political drives that inform every other form of politics, including sexual politics with a loved one. So I've been saying a lot here in a very short period of time about the overarching context of the world that we live in, the political landscape that we live in. So I'm curious if anybody has any thoughts or any questions about that that you would like to share. So if you do, feel free to type something into the text box. And I'm going to do so that you can see that the text box is live. So I'm just typing in our phone number here so that you can call an intake counselor if you have any questions or concerns about your own sex and love issues. Feel free to call us, and that's also where I would get your comments. And so it looks like I have a comment here. Oops, but I can't read it. So is there anyway, if you have anything that you want to add to this conversation or any questions that you have, feel free to just text them to me and I'll do my best to answer them. So let's look at the politics of loving kindness as opposed to the politics of staying safe in a family, staying safe in a workplace, manipulating others, negotiating with others in order to stay safe. Because if you learn that in a family because you had to in order to survive, then it's likely that you're going to bring those same dynamics into your relationships with other people, certainly with friends and definitely with loved ones. So see if you can notice the ways in which you perhaps have already shifted and changed the ways that you believe and the ways that you've behaved from the time that you were in your family to your adulthood. And maybe you've done this by way of your own therapy. Maybe you've done it because you've been in a 12-step program or some other self-awareness process you've been engaged in over time that has had you starting to shift the way that you organize yourself. And if that's the case, then certainly give yourself credit for that. So politics has a nobler meaning as well, and the behaviors that make us find healthy values of acceptance and forgiveness within ourselves and lead us to embody those values in daily thoughts and acts has to do with the politics of loving kindness. So let me just say that again, that we could think of politics as Washington, D.C., or politics as our local community politics, or the politics that take place in our church, or the politics that take place in a corporate structure, and thinking that we have to be politic in order to negotiate those waters, meaning you have to be tactful and you have to say the right things and you've got to be strategic about what you say to make sure that you don't ruffle any feathers. And that's sort of in some ways the cost of doing business, as they say, in some organizations that don't invite transparency and the ability to talk frankly in direct, open, and honest ways with each other. But when we think about politics as behaviors that make us find healthy values and that make us find acceptance and forgiveness within ourselves, then we can start to thinking about how that political way of being helps us embody new values, and that we play out those values in every single day and in the acts that we engage in. So an example that I might give you is if you were to adopt the politics of kindness, for example, because we have the example here of loving kindness. You might say that today you're going to practice loving kindness with whomever you meet. And it doesn't matter how agitated you get or how wrong or how off the mark you think somebody else was, whether it's your lover or your workmate. But that you're going to practice loving kindness and see how that plays out for you. So on the one hand, we could say, oh, that's manipulative. Maybe it is. But it's a, quote, manipulation in the direction of trying to create healthy values for oneself and to stay sort of on the mark or within the range of the way in which you want to live. And in so doing, we start practicing this loving kindness regardless of the circumstances, and we start to see that that spills over in all areas of our lives. Oftentimes, we're more inclined to practice that loving kindness with strangers than we are with our most beloved. And we will do it maybe more with our children than with our partners, or with our friends more than with our partners, because we feel some anxiety or resentment towards them. So take a leap and see if you can start to practice this new way of being with the people that are maybe the most difficult for you. So even our lovemaking can become a noble political act that breaks the pattern of manipulation and exploitation. And especially if you've been one of these people or have been a person who have used sex as a way to exploit other people. Oftentimes people that are sexually addicted or compulsive will say that they have indeed been sexually proprieties, that they have been predators in certain ways, maybe not in the sort of way of non-consensual sex or sexual harassment, but the way in which they sort of went about getting people to have sex with them was manipulative, seductive. There was a politic to it that they used. And in recovery, people are inclined to say, hey, I was one of those people that used men or women for sex. And for that, I feel bad about, and I don't want to continue that on. And in fact, getting into a healthy love relationship is really going to challenge those ways of being for someone. So if you have any thoughts or questions about that, certainly chime in about that. So another way of thinking about this is, are we dividing or are we uniting? And that is sort of the polarity of politics also. Politics can unite people. It can unite an organization, it can unite a culture, a country, or it can divide it. And what's required for uniting is humility, openness, and goodwill, which allows us to shift from this win-lose, us-them paradigm of personal politics to a win-win paradigm of cooperation. Now, one of the things I think is worth mentioning here is that when we wrote these meditations, we were very clear, and I wrote this as such in the introduction, that these are aspirations, that no human being is perfect and is going to get this right all the time. But certainly we live in a time right now where there's so much atrocity and so much divisiveness that if we all aspire to this possibility of humility, not humiliation, that's already going on, humility, openness, and goodwill, and moving towards a paradigm that when I get mine, then you get yours, as opposed to you get yours after I get mine, and I'm so selfish, I've got, all this wealth or all of this acquisition, and you have a tiny bit. That's sort of the imbalance we have right now. But if we start to think about giving to others, and that knowing that when we give to others, when we're kind, and if I bring this back to a relational example, when I am kind to you, you're going to be kind to me in return. If I'm just waiting for you to be kind, I can sit over here being bitter and resentful, and that I'm never going to get what I want, and then I can become manipulative or seductive to get what I want from you. And all of that is very divisive. So we have to be the bigger person. We have to throw down the gauntlet. We have to make the first move. And that's what I would challenge you to do as well. And consider that a personal politic is always happening within each one of us. It can be underhanded and scheming. It can be stereotyping and minimizing. It can seek to divide and conquer. And how many times in a day do we do some version of that? I noticed yesterday I was on a flight coming back from Arkansas where I was teaching, and I had to leave from Little Rock and go to Vegas, and then I had a layover in Vegas and come to LA. And by the time I was getting on the plane to LA, I was kind of cranky. It was a long day, I was tired, and everybody's jostling for seats. And there's no overhead compartments. And I noticed that my inclination was to sort of like squash somebody else's bag so I could wedge my bag in there. And there I was doing something that was sort of underhanded and scheming. But it was all about me getting what I wanted in that moment. And I caught myself and I thought, you know what, maybe you just shouldn't sit in the seat. Maybe you should sit further in the back of the plane. It was Southwest Air, by the way, where you don't have assigned seats. And so rather than creating duress for everyone around me and myself, I had to take a different politic, if you would, and decide that I was not going to be so aggressive in that way, and make a space for everyone around me. So someone, Charlie is online, or someone's online that's reminding you that if you have questions for me, to please join the conversation by writing your thoughts here, or you can email them to charlie@centerforhealthysex.com. So when we practice the different politic, as I was saying, one that keeps us present with empathy, for all life, including everyone. And I was having compassion, not just for the people around me, but for myself. Like, why did I want to put myself in that position that I was going to get other people disgruntled and feel selfish? It had that feeling of, jockeying for a parking spot, the way we all can do if we live in major metropolitan areas where we can all get sort of pushy about who's going to get the spot. And I've seen people get into really bad fights over, a parking spot. So can we engage in a politic that keeps us present with empathy for all life and unites ourselves to others through unconditional love or unconditional caring, or even if you can't go that far, to just simple compassion, being a good neighbor, saying, you know what, it's just not worth it. It's not worth my aggravation. It's not worth someone else's aggravation who's doing their best to engage with somebody. So these are our daily healthy sex acts for sexual politics today. We believe everyone has the right to experience healthy sex and love, free from trauma, abuse, violence, crimes, lies, secrets, judgment, shame, guilt, and regrets. I think this is a universal belief and wish from people that work in the sexology community, certainly from the World Health Organization, that we are looking for the right to our own sexual expression, freedom, our bodies, having sex the way we want it with consent. And this is our shared philosophy and politics. So what would you underline, add, or subtract from this list, and why? And if anybody wants to send me a note about that, I'd really appreciate it, because I think this is a very important conversation. And increasingly, I don't think it's about the answers, because I don't know we're going to get answers to these very, very big socio-political questions. But I do know that when people start talking about these things, when we really start having conversations about it, that's how change starts to happen, because we're engaged, because we're thinking, because we're talking, because we're in community about it. And that's been evidenced by the #MeToo movement, that when one person decided to speak out and say, yeah, this has happened to me too, then all of a sudden hundreds of thousands of women and men around the world are coming out and saying, yeah, this has happened to me too. So that which has been sort of roiling underground is now coming out, and so that we're having a conversation about what has happened to us. And this is no different than any trauma. For those of you that have been in therapy, you know that sometimes you're telling a therapist something for the first time, that you've never told another living soul about what happened to you. And that simple act of telling somebody starts to change the way we feel about it internally. And it literally changes our brain and our nervous systems so that we become more integrated, less dissociated. We start to even feel a little bit more whole inside, because we've been able to feel our sadness or our anger or our pain around it. So I want to encourage you. This isn't about a public forum for processing your pain necessarily, but just to talk about what's happened to you with other people, because we have this collective healing that we're all going to have to go through, whether it's that you've had a loved one gunned down or killed in the last couple months here in the United States by way of guns, or this, truck that murdered people in New York last week. Whatever has happened to you, or that you were sexually harassed or abused in some ways, now is the time to start having these conversations, because that's the only way our politics about these issues is going to change. So think about then what you would underline, what you would highlight, what you would add or subtract from this list. What is true for you? And how do you want to live your life? So how do you define healthy sex and love? Because this is a question that people ask me all the time, and my answer is I don't know the answer to that question. Only you can answer that question for yourself, just like only I can answer it for myself. So how do you think about this, and how do you answer it for yourself? And then what political statements are you making through your relationships? through your communications, your actions, your appearance, to practice this philosophy in your life. So certainly those people who have not spoken about harassment for so many years were making a political statement, even though they didn't know it. And that statement was that the patriarchy has the power and I'm subjugated to that and I don't get to speak because of it. And that is not blaming the victim. That has been a collective political statement that's been made, and it's been implicit, it's been tacit, nobody's talked about it. And those people who have come forward now are saying, I am changing the political statement I'm making. I'm going to come forward and tell the truth. And it's worth noting that many women who are accusing some of these powerful men, and many men and boys who are accusing these powerful men, have nothing to gain from it. The statute of limitations has run out. They can't get any money from this. They're simply coming forward because they're tired of being silenced. And by coming forward, they are making a political statement through their communications and through their actions. And likewise, I would want to encourage all of you to think closely about what is your philosophy about sex and sexuality? What are your politics about sex and sexuality? How do you treat people of the opposite sex? How do you treat people who have different sexual orientations? How do you treat people of color? And what are the ways that you're doing to make a difference, both for yourself and for those marginalized populations? So it doesn't look like we have any questions today. And I will say that really ends our little conversation here on sexual politics. But I do want to challenge you in this time now when people are tweeting, people are on social media, people are coming out and speaking to their human resources departments, for you to think long and hard about whether you have perpetrated or whether you've been on the receiving end of perpetration. And if you have, what are you going to do to make that right today? So for those of you that did join me today, thank you for joining me on this webinar about sexual politics. Remember that you can buy Mirror of Intimacy at Amazon.com, and I look forward to seeing you next month. In the meantime, happy Thanksgiving and take good care.